something pretty weird is happening. There are some loud, fairly obnoxious voices online, Laura Loomer and James Lindsay, just to name two, that are constantly going after the Vice President JD Vance. And while they do it, they're claiming that they are the people actually trying to keep the president's coalition together. That's a little strange, because for people who don't watch this super closely, it all feels a little bit like Upside Down world. You're attacking people, but you're keeping it together. How does that work? But they seem to have lost sight of how President Donald Trump came to choose JD Vance to be the vice president in the first place. Trump came millimeters from death on the campaign trail in Butler, Pennsylvania, when an assassin's bullet grazed the former president's right ear on July 13th, 2024. And the left hadn't been shy about their violent Trump fantasies, see Kathy Griffin or Johnny Depp or any of these people. But the Butler assassination attempt proves some were really deadly serious about killing the president. With the Republican National Convention starting that Monday, Trump was in the final stages of choosing a running mate. But that debate now took on a whole new meaning after Butler. What if our worst nightmare came true and they killed the former president? The answer, as the president cried from the stage in Butler, swarmed by Secret Service agents, was obviously to fight. But who was going to be the person to step into the ring? Who could maintain the coalition that Trump built? Who could keep the MAGA movement alive? And Trump's near-death experience triggered an around-the-clock debate among the right's most powerful players on who could actually do it, who could fill that role. And on July 15th, 2024, Trump chose Vance. Over the course of the 2024 campaign, Trump built a broad electoral coalition we've talked a lot about on this show. It included the Teamsters and the tech giants from Silicon Valley, disaffected liberals and social conservatives, health nuts and Hispanics, nationalists and libertarians. There is no doubt that Trump built this coalition through hard work and the art of the deal. Democrats in the establishment, meanwhile, marshaled every resource at their disposal to destroy him and his movement. They failed. And Trump is the centralizing force for the coalition that elected him. No doubt about that. You can pick a vice president for all kinds of reasons. You can try to boost your vote with a chosen voter demographic, with women, with Latinos, with African Americans. And you could look to win a crucial swing state. Oh, my vice president's from Pennsylvania or North Carolina. And you can add some kind of credibility to your bid by choosing someone more experienced. That was the case with Obama choosing Joe Biden. Or you could shore up a part of your coalition threatening to go rogue. You see Mike Pence in 2016 make the old guard a little bit more comfortable with the changes that Trump wanted to make with the Republican Party. Or you can choose someone who can take up the mantle. And Vance seems like the kind of pick to take up the mantle. Every vector of this coalition that we talk about all the time also points back to Vance. His upbringing and his Catholic faith has given him a passion and appreciation for the working class and its values. But he also spent 2 years in Silicon Valley before returning to Ohio, trying to bring jobs and opportunity back to his hometown. He served in the military, and he understands the need for a strong national defense, but he also knows how military adventurism around the world has failed to keep America safe. Maintaining that coalition is going to be full of challenges. There's no doubt about that. Especially as there are those seeking to claim there's some kind of civil war happening in the administration. And of course, there's probably a lot of infighting, probably a lot of debates being held in private, as there are in any administration, and you'd hope that would be the case, right? But you see that in public? No, you don't. And it's almost as if those incessantly posturing about the Civil War in the right actually want to make it happen. 2026 midterms are just around the corner, but 2028 isn't that far off either. And it's a dynamic and unique time in the conservative movement, and JD Vance is poised to play a big role. And that is why Frank DeVito is out with a new book on vice president called JD Vance and the Future of the Republican Party. He joins us this week on the Signal Sitdown. We hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Frank DeVito, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks for having me, Bradley.
So we're here today to talk about your new book, JD Vance and the Future of the Republican Party. It's your first book.
Yeah.
And I think it comes at a really important time. You know, the midterms are right around the corner. The President Trump's coalition is united in most ways, but there are some real debates happening in intellectual circles on the right about what the future of the Republican Party will actually be. And you've got somebody in the vice presidency that would not have been anywhere close to the vice presidency in the Bush administration, for example. It's a very new style of Republican politics, a Republican politics that kind of emerges from a decade of a Trump-dominated Republican Party. Much can be said about the new right and GOP's alliance with populism, or what aspects of populism has made its way into the GOP. And we're going to unpack all of that today. But before we do, I just want to ask you, first book, that's always a big accomplishment, but why did you want to write this book?
Yeah, thank you. That's a fun question to answer. So, I've been following Vance for probably longer than most. I read Hillbilly Elegy and was really interested in the guy before he ran for Senate, before he was anything other than an author who wrote a New York Times bestseller. But I started writing right after the 2024 election for a couple of reasons. The first one is he was just the heir apparent to the Republican Party, right? At a really interesting time, right? Trump is, like you said, dominated the party and the ongoing realignment of policy priorities and what the faction consists of. It's been one man at the helm, a uniquely charismatic man for over a decade. And so what comes after he steps off the scene in 2028 is going to be a defining moment for the Republican Party, potentially for the country. And it's not a big roll of the dice to write a book on Vance as the heir apparent, right? Because my argument, I can't see the counterpoint to this, is that Vance was basically chosen as the heir apparent. Not that Trump is going to go out and say, this is my successor. Trump doesn't play like that. But why else would you pick him as VP? I think it's a really interesting question. I've kind of gone through this a lot over the months and while I was writing the book. But I mean, he's young, doesn't have a lot of political experience. He's a white Christian man from a reliably red state. Right. So if you're doing the demographic thing, Trump didn't pick a woman. He didn't pick a Latino. He didn't pick a black candidate. He's not trying to shore up any particular swing state support. Why did he pick Vance? I think what you're left with, there's no real electoral advantage except to shore up your base and pick somebody young who's going to pick up the banner and go from there. So that's the main reason I wrote the book, is just Vance is an important figure at an important time in the Republican Party. But on the other hand, I'm kind of a nerd. Like I'd rather be reading Aquinas and writing things on like legal and political theory. So this is probably the most popular I would get for writing. So as a first book, the reason that I thought it was worth doing and really enjoyable is that, if you're going to profile your average politician who's making a run for president, you got campaign speeches and you've got their track record in the legislature, if they're legislators or whatever. But there's usually not a lot there that's of particular interest to me. But Vance is a unique intellectual figure on the right? Besides Hillbilly Elegy, he's a public intellectual, right? He's writing really high-level op-eds on everything from his religious conversion to policy priorities to the shifting sands of the new right, if you will. So just for somebody who wants to do an intellectual profile and really dig deep into who is this guy, what does he think, there's really good material there. Mm-hmm. So that's what the book was largely based on. It's partially a reflection on the future of the Republican Party, but a lot of it is an analysis, a piecing together of, I think, Vance's most important writings and what they say about the man.
Yeah, and I mean, you being a guy who reads Thomas Aquinas for fun, there must have been a lot of relief when you can have somebody writing about these big ideas in a very deep way in the span of 1,500 words across these op-eds, right? If you can master that skill, you've set yourself up well for success in at least the line of work that I'm in.
That's right.
Forward for this book, written by Michael Knowles, and I know for a fact that people in the administration close to the vice president are reading this book right now.
Love to hear that.
Yeah, I saw it with my own eyes. I'm not just pumping you up. So when you mentioned JD as the heir apparent, I think a lot of people forget, because I was there, the president is nearly assassinated in Butler on a Saturday. And Monday, we have JD Vance named the vice presidential pick. The reason I was in Butler is because I thought I was working at the American Conservative at the time, and we thought that there was going to be a VP announcement at Butler.
Yeah.
And it kind of became clear when I got there that there wasn't going to be that announcement. And the president is within millimeters of being shot in the head. And then I feel like that kind of changes somebody's calculation when choosing who is going to be the person that's a heartbeat away from the presidency. We'll return to that in just a second, but not every vice president is considered heir apparent. If you look at the Obama administration, for example, nobody thought that Joe Biden was going to inherit the Democratic Party that Barack Obama built. Same thing with Dick Cheney. Same thing with Kamala Harris. And same thing to a large degree with Mike Pence. Nobody thought Mike Pence was an heir apparent pick. But I think the best example is the Kamala example, right? Where you have an older, more senior person who's been a high profile figure in the party for a long time, Joe Biden for decades, but Trump a decade, choosing someone younger to be their number two. But no one ever talked about Kamala as the inheritor. But we are talking about JD like that. A lot of folks are. Why is that? What's the difference between those figures that I mentioned and JD in the current moment that we're in?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are different ways you can take that. So there's partially you just pick vice presidents, like I said, for different reasons. Like sometimes you're doing it to look back rather than to look forward. I think that's largely the Pence pick. You look at Trump in 2016, very different world, hasn't yet solidified support in the Republican base.
Well, Mike Pence was working alongside Ted Cruz and other figures like John Kasich at the time to try to prevent Trump the nomination.
Right. But once he locks it in, right, Trump isn't looking for, I think at this point, he's looking to bring together a coalition, not to pick his successor. And so he picks somebody who's palatable to the old guard and, he's an evangelical and can speak the language of old, like pre-Trump Republican politics and, assuage the fears of a lot of old Republicans who are wondering what the heck is happening. So I think that's a very different pick. The Biden-Kamala one is an interesting question because I think it's different because Biden's not picking his successor because Biden's not the leader of the Democrat Party, right? He's not bringing in a new movement. He's not like paving the way for the next generation of what the Democratic Party is going to look like. He's, a kind of a figurehead who's being manipulated or run by whoever. It's pretty clear by the end that Biden wasn't really running the country or the Democrat Party, right? So different equation. I think that's what makes the Vance pick for Trump so unique because yes, Trump is now going into a lame duck term, so he just practically is going to be replaced by somebody. But as I said, he's headed a complete overhaul of the Republican Party. Views on everything from foreign policy interventionism to trade and labor policy, everything is shifting. Different demographics are coming in and going out of the Republican Party. So it's a unique time of change in the party, and Trump was uniquely the presider over all of that, right? So I think he has so much power, so much influence over the last decade that there's a unique question of who comes next that you don't always have when you have a presidential changeover.
Well, in a lot of ways, everybody knows the hillbilly elegy story at this point, whether you've seen it in the movie form or you've read it in the book or you've listened to JD's speeches on the campaign trail. You have the general outlines of that. But there's this strange, like JD, his life story kind of melds together all the different threads that Trump tied together in the 2024 coalition, in the 2024 election cycle, right? JD comes from this kind of forgotten community, working class background, devastation of globalization, right? He's kind of emerging from that. He has ties to the military. He serves there. He has ties to elite institutions. He goes to Yale Law School. He has ties to Silicon Valley. He works there for 2 years, and then he comes back to Ohio, and he ultimately runs for office. And so it's not just the hillbilly elegy story. Now, the hillbilly elegy story is critically important because it informs how Vance goes in and enters these elite circles later on in his life. But at the same time, like, you've got the tech world coming in and supporting Trump. You've got all these different kind of factions competing for the president's time, competing for the president's attention, competing for the right's attention. Yeah. And it feels like JD's politics in his life kind of puts him in the middle of all of that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, lay it out for us. What are the kind of tensions here? I remember when JD gave a presentation, I believe it was to, I can't remember if it was the Yale Republicans Club, but some Republicans Club, and it was kind of during the COVID era. And he said, called them on them to be traitors to their class, which is like, you have these elite credentials, you have these elite affiliations, but what you should really be doing is using those affiliations to help working class people. Is that kind of the way that we should understand JD's connections to Silicon Valley and these elite institutions? Or, a lot of people have accused the vice president, especially during the campaign cycle, right? That was the first thing that they trotted out was JD Vance gives his hillbilly elegy story, and they say, actually, this guy's all faking it. He's two-faced. He went to Yale Law School, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I see a very complicated person and story, but one that is really, I think, fit for the times ahead for all the reasons that you said, right? So who is he? Like, as a person, what's the formative experience? Who is this guy who occupies, right, the office of the vice president? I think it's a mix, but I think ultimately the kid who grew up in hollowed out Middletown, Ohio is, polished, formed, has seen the world and been transformed by a lot, including grace from his Catholic conversion, which we can talk about if you'd like. But that's still very much with him. I think to say that he was like, hightailed it out of Middletown and now he's like a Yale Silicon Valley guy, just like everybody else. It's clearly not true. I think both by the way that he thinks about policy and politics, but also by the choices he made even before he ran, right? So I think the storyline is pretty important that he goes to the military first because he feels like he's not equipped for college, which is really interesting. He's like, I don't even know how to make my bed, let alone fill out the FAFSA forms and do all this. I can't go to school yet. So he does the Marine Corps, gets out, goes to Ohio State, gets into Yale Law School, and then does a little bit of law. He clerks for a federal district court, ends up in Silicon Valley pretty quickly. But he leaves. He's not in Silicon Valley for very long. I think people kind of forget that because the timeline, the way most people think about him is you have the story in Hillbilly Elegy, and then it ends around like 2015, 16, and then you have like this guy who emerges as the Senate candidate. But what happens in between actually really matters. So right, he goes to Silicon Valley, and he writes an interesting piece. I think it was at the American Conservative when he leaves Silicon Valley, and he returns to Ohio. Right, he goes back to Cincinnati, and he says something really interesting. He's like, these are my words, but he's breathed the rarefied air of like the highest places in American elite society. Right, he goes to Yale Law. He's in the Silicon Valley elite for a couple of years, and one of the disconnects he talks about that makes him really uncomfortable is. Well, I mean, Yale Law School, I think, made him uncomfortable all the way through because of cultural differences, class differences. But at Silicon Valley, he says, I'm with all these people who are, and he says raising kids, but maybe raising a kid, right? But they're so hopeful and like in the clouds about like the future of technology and society and education and everything is so, on the up and up. This is so great. It's like, it was such a jarring foreign experience to him. He's like, I'm married, we're like starting to have kids, and this is not America. This is not my it is part of America technically, but like this is not the experience of the people I grew up with. This is not my experience. Like this is not my place in a way, right? And so he goes back to Ohio and he starts to do some fundraising, some venture capital stuff, but particularly set it on trying to bring investment and business into his native place, right? Not more tech in Silicon Valley, but some revitalization of like an ordinary American town. So anyway, I use that because I think it's really important. Who is JD Vance? I don't think there's much evidence to say that he's just this Yale Silicon Valley fraud who pretends to be hillbilly elegy guy because I don't think he's lived that way. I think he's somebody who's experienced the elite. He understands what that culture is like. But I mean, the experiences of his childhood are so obviously formative to who he is, right? Like the centrality of the broken family and the fatherlessness. You can see how attentive he is to making sure that he has a stable marriage and a stable home for his kids, despite how crazy busy his life is. The focus on reshoring manufacturing and re-stimulating American industry, very colored by his grandfather was a steel worker, but the steel industry all left Ohio in the days when Vance was living there. And so I think those, educated, formed, changed, matured by the experience that happened after. But I think he's still very much a guy affected by growing up as an ordinary American in an ordinary town.
Mm-hmm. And his largest task right now is being Trump's number two. Being the number two to the president is always difficult. Doesn't matter who the president is, but when you have a president that is this dynamic, this active, this bold, following that is difficult. You know, people in journalism like myself get paid to follow this stuff, and we can't even keep up. So if an entire newsroom can't keep up, I imagine how difficult it must be for a Secretary of State or a Vice President to do that. But, you know, he's done a really good job of playing that role and not getting out in front of the administration or the president and kind of staying in his lane, which is appropriate not only for when you are the vice president to Donald Trump, but when you are the vice president to anybody. And at the same time, he sits at this node, like behind the scenes. He's the guy who kind of keeps the coalition together in a lot of ways, right? Like he knows the David Saxes of the world. He knows the people who work in the office of the president doing domestic policy. He knows the restraint and realism communities in the foreign policy space. He has long been an advocate for tightening America's immigration laws and Americans' immigration policies. So explain to me how you think Vance is managing that particular role and why every sort of vector, and sometimes these vectors are like allied against one another, right? Sometimes like the tech people and the domestic policy people really bump heads. That's not only in the administration. You can see it on social media. It's not a secret. But they all kind of point to JD. Say like, oh, well, we're kind of claiming the mantle of JD, or we're kind of claiming the mantle of JD. Less so than claiming the mantle of the president or Trumpism. But behind the scenes, it's like all the vectors are kind of pointing towards the vice president. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, your point about, and I'll get to that, but what the vice president's job is pretty clear, which makes it challenging when you're entering into now the second year of a lame duck administration, if you are in fact going to run for president. My guess, and this is all just speculation, but is that in the next year or so, as Vance, I think, angles and prepares to announce a run for president, my guess is around the midterms or just after. But there's going to have to be some kind of a conversation between the Trump people and the Vance people about giving him a little bit more leeway to distinguish himself, because he's been a very good number two, carrying water for Trump, executing the president's agenda. But obviously, without breaking, he's going to have to show that he's his own man and his own candidate. So I'll be curious to see how that plays out. But to your question about how all these vectors lead to Vance, I think it's fascinating. And it's why he's such an interesting person to profile, and so interesting to me in particular, is first of all, I'm a happy generalist. Like I write essays on whatever strikes my fancy, law, politics, culture, religion from day to day. So I like the kind of breadth of knowledge that I think is very clear in Vance. You see his writings and see how widely read and interested and connected he is in everything. So I think the reason he's so able to be kind of at the center of this coalition is, well, two things. First of all, I think he has a unique blend, right? You have usually these dichotomies of the intellectuals and the people who do stuff in politics, right? And there's often a really wide gulf. Like I know a lot of really good intellectual academic people, some of whom are just really not good at understanding how their theories play out in practical coalitional politics. And then on the other side, you have plenty of people who are involved in politics who don't read, right? Or think very deeply about much of anything. And of course, I'm not naming names here. And I'm thinking mostly of local and state experiences. I'm not calling out anyone that anybody would know here. So the unique thing about Vance, I think he's very good at both. This is my main point. When you have somebody who, on the one hand, is a brilliant political tactician. I mean, to win that crowded out field in that Ohio primary in 2021 was masterful political tactics done by people like Luke Thompson behind the scenes. But JD Vance's own instincts were very good in figuring out how to navigate that field, how to make the case for the conversion to Trump from never Trump, just a master politician. So when you have somebody who's that good at navigating coalitional politics and getting elected to office, but who can also tell you like the theoretical differences between a West Coast Straussian and a Catholic integralist, and right, I think he deeply understands the movement at an intellectual level. What are these different philosophical principles within the party. How do they play out in different policy prescriptions and priorities? So I think that's maybe the roundabout answer to your question. How does he end up this guy? I think it's a really unique mixture of political acumen and intellectual depth in the conservative movement that not a lot of people have.
Yeah, and kind of coming into the conservative movement at a very dynamic time in the conservative intellectual milieu where, you know, Trump had kind of done away with not only the Bushes and Cheneys of the world, right? These like old guard legacy families, but he also changed the permission structure completely in whether it's the op-ed pages of various right-wing publications, various right-wing think tanks, but also just totally made the future of the party up for grabs. And you've seen that play out between all these types of, right, the post-liberals, the Straussians, the West Coast Straussians, the East Coast Straussians. Oh, no, it's the NatCons, it's this, it's that. You know, you could, it's like, you know, it's like you can split this a million different ways if you so choose.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you need to have somebody who can bring them back to the center of politics, to the center of what politics is actually about in a republic, which is getting elected and then governing.
Right.
And JD seems uniquely gifted at that. But, you know, he's elected in 2022 to the Senate, wins that Ohio primary, that pretty brutal Ohio primary, and wins handily in the election in 22. And he spends 2 years as a senator from Ohio before being named to the vice presidential role. When he's like, what are those 2 years like for him in the Senate? Because he has to build an alliance with the president and a pretty robust legislative portfolio to kind of prove that JD Vance is for real.
Yeah.
And he's not like angling for the vice presidency as he's putting together these pieces of legislation, but okay, JD Vance is there now and he needs to prove that he is for real, because one of the liabilities that younger politicians have is like the Obama liability, which is like, okay, this guy doesn't have any foreign policy experience. How experienced is he really? Who do we need to bring in to help him, you know, navigate this process? Oh, we know, we'll bring in Joe Biden, right? Like that was
Right.
that was the answer.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, and that's why nobody thought Biden was going to be the heir, right? Biden was the hand of the king, essentially, for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
But tell me about those 2 years in the Senate and how it kind of sets up JD being picked as the vice presidential nominee.
Yeah, so it's an interesting time to be a fresh junior senator and to rise that quickly, because the Republicans are not in the majority during his time there. And so the reality is, as it is, the percentage of bills that are introduced versus that are passed, it's minuscule, right? So most of these bills are trying to do something else other than become laws, but especially when you're in the minority, right? There's very little chance that anything meaningful that Vance is going to introduce or sponsor or be heavily involved in, likely not going to become law. So then the choices of bills, how they're crafted, what they're about, is in a lot of ways, it's a messaging, it's a growing who you are. There's obviously some practical experience of trying to usher them through the process, but everybody knows that these kind of hot bills that he's introducing are not going anywhere in a Democrat-controlled Congress, right? So what did he actually do? There's actually a chapter in the book where I lay out a bunch of the bills that he had sponsored that I thought were particularly interesting and that probably summarized what makes him or puts him on Trump's radar as somebody on the right page here. And I'll just pick a few. I don't have the book open, but I know most of them at this point. So there's some interesting stuff on foreign policy. And I'll just caveat with this. It's clever stuff. It's not like a stupid, like, well, we're going to, pass a bill to end this war, close the border. Like they're really nuanced, kind of fun bills to read through that he had sponsored and written. So you have, like, on foreign policy, there's a bill he introduces regarding China, basically setting a bunch of parameters where if they're stealing IP, if they're caught doing several things that are violations of international law, it proposed mechanisms to basically cut them off from U.S. Markets, which was, I think, a really, really smart way of, in proposing what are the economic ways to continue to try to bring China to heel rather than just posture and wait for them to invade Taiwan. Right? So I thought that was very clever. There was a bill, I believe, about auditing all the money that had been sent over to the Ukraine war, like asking for receipts basically on where all these billions of dollars were spent. So those were both interesting on foreign policy. He actually introduced a bill making English the official language of the United States, which shouldn't be particularly controversial, but believe it or not, it becomes quite a controversial thing. I actually have a friend in one of the executive agencies now who they introduced some regulations saying that we're only promulgating all of our rules and stuff in English, and it was like a firestorm of lawsuits. So, and there were some good bills on immigration, but I think those are the ones that stick out. He's really shown himself like on immigration, on foreign policy, on these issues that the president clearly cares about, that the MAGA base clearly, or New Right, whatever you want to say, clearly cares about. What are some ways that we can propose like creative solutions that might actually do something rather than just bills that can give you, 30 seconds on TikTok or whatever. So I think it was pretty clever. He picked the right issues. He showed a good depth of understanding of how you can use policy to actually do something.
Yeah, and over that 2-year period, the East Palestine tragedy, he was very involved in that, trying to figure out, okay, what are ways that we can actually make sure that this doesn't happen again? And that was, I think a point of tension within the right, broadly construed.
Mm-hmm.
People took a lot of issue with how he was trying to grapple with that.
Mm-hmm.
And there were always these criticisms, especially, of course, in his primary, but throughout his Senate tenure, where neoconservative elements of the Republican Party were trying to take him out. Were trying to make him a very undesirable choice for President Trump to pick as his vice president. And there's these forces aligned against JD Vance. And JD Vance overcomes those forces, I think, in part, and I don't know anything, I'm not giving anyone special information. This is just someone who observed the events at Butler and then observed the 48 hours that followed and was there at the Republican National Convention. Like, I think the brush with death had something to do with this choice, seriously. And there were great people in JD's corner. There was the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., Charlie Kirk was one of the biggest advocates for JD being picked as the vice presidential candidate. But there were a lot of people who were not happy. They were not happy going into that fight, and they certainly were left unhappy after that fight. Why?
Yeah. I think it depends on who you're talking about. So I have a couple of theories about this. The more simple one is just there are a lot of people who have pre-Trump W. Bush era instincts. Like they grew up watching Fox News. They have a very set way of viewing the world and America's institutions. They think, things swing left, things swing right, but everything's pretty much healthy. And so a lot of them tend to be kind of hawkish on foreign policy and interventionism, although that's, I think, starting to shift. And then, well, how do I want to say that? I think there's a long culture of people from Christian backgrounds, Christian cultures, talking to their Christian base with very social conservative messaging, but who don't actually want to get anything done on the social issues that affect ordinary Americans on a lot of issues. I won't say too much more about that. But so the simple answer is just Trump changed the party. There became this kind of like aggressive, the institutions are in really bad shape and more drastic measures are needed if we're actually going to save America. Shift to things that I think made a lot of them uncomfortable, like mass deportations and closing the border. So there's some domestic stuff, but I mean, ultimately my instinct is that this isn't just a bunch of normies who are uncomfortable with a change in tone in the party. I think it's largely a fight about foreign policy and the priorities of the Republican Party. So that's my best take on it. Is it right? The Republican Party for quite a while has been in this Cold War mentality, even after the Cold War ended, where, now our job is to go and spread liberal democracy, whatever that means, to the four corners of the world. And that's kind of like part of America's mission. And then we've like recreated this myth where like, that's what America does. We're the safeguarders of democracy the world over. That's not America's history, right? But it's a powerful narrative. And there are a lot of people who came into the Republican Party as neoconservatives who were kind of anti-communist Cold War warriors, but who are essentially liberals in their outlook on most things. And they've been pretty powerful in foreign policy and state and defense and in Republican politics writ large. So I think that's the big fight. When you say, why does not everybody, applaud when Vance is the heir? Because Trump was such an enigma and nobody quite knew what he was going to do. And he's definitely made some war hawks unhappy with kind of a realignment toward maybe more Monroe doctrine. We're going to focus on this hemisphere, quick and efficient, not forever wars. But I think people see, first of all, maybe Trump, we can get him to go away, right? After Trump does his decade, that we can start to reassert pre-Trump era candidates and foreign policy commitments. And but I think Vance would be the nail in the coffin on that, because I think his instincts have shown that he's, very much aligned with the president, but has instincts to stay out of unnecessary interventions, maybe more so than Trump. I don't think there's a big gap between them, but I think for the party who is used to foreign policy intervention abroad, he's bad news.
So this is a really interesting point, that there are basically deep state elements within the right, whether or not those elements actually are in the deep state or just appreciate the deep state, have a lot of alignment with what the deep state is pursuing, namely the extension of American foreign policy, the extension of American empire in the name of a bunch of liberal priorities and a bunch of liberal prerogatives, namely like regime change and the creation of democratic institutions. Right? There's quite a lot of overlap between those deep staters and these neoconservative figures in the party. And you could convince folks that Trump was just a blip on the radar, that normal programming will continue soon after this short break.
Right.
But when JD Vance is the pick, that kind of goes away. And their hope was, we'll spend the Trump years figuring out how to ape this messaging, take back over the party, using the mantle of America First to convince you why the next regime change is a good idea, or why we need to, increase foreign aid spending to infinity and beyond, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it becomes clear that it's not a blip, and it also becomes much more difficult to ape the MAGA talking points if you have somebody, like JD Vance, in the co-pilot seat. Yeah. When they lose that fight, it seems like everybody comes together for the general. And I think a lot of it had to do with not only one, but the first, but the second assassination attempt on President Donald Trump. The effort to just install Kamala Harris without sort of any primary process by the Democrats, right? Like, that was a real source of unity. And I think the base was, of course, pleased with JD Vance, I think, since the beginning. But when we get to election day, the folks in this town who have the pettiest disagreements of all time, right? The chattering class folks, the think tank folks, the folks on Capitol Hill, everybody's united. Mm-hmm. But in the past year, you have seen the folks who lost that fight, the fight for who's going to be vice president, rear their ugly head again and try to pin all sorts of things on the right. All sorts of things on the right that Vance has nothing to do with on JD.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are sitting around wondering, why are people trying to sabotage JD and the coalition in this way? Yeah. What is the threat that he poses to them?
I think it's probably the same as the previous question in a way, is that Trump could be seen as a decade-long enigma, but Trump and then Vance, that, if Vance wins 2028, that's a total of 16 years of not the old guard running the Republican Party. That's almost a full generation. That's the end of an era in a very complete way. And I think it just makes a lot of people uncomfortable. There's one thing I want to say about that, because they're already starting to, the chattering middle, the neocons on the out.
The right liberals.
Yeah. There's already a really fascinating shift going on. I don't know if you've seen this, and it makes me really annoyed that we haven't already caught on to this, how every Republican who is the guy is the worst we've ever seen. He's Hitler, right. Literally Hitler, right? This is not my quote. This is all the major media outlets. But it's like, aren't we tired of this? Because if you look back, I'm old enough to remember when W. Bush was president and the Iraq war was starting to get unpopular. And the mainstream media was labeling him this war criminal monster who was the worst person we've ever seen. And they attacked Reagan in similar ways. And then Trump comes along, and all of a sudden they're longing for the days of good Republicans like George W. Bush, and Trump is a fascist dictator who's going to destroy the Constitution. But now you're already starting to see the shift, which makes me feel good that JD Vance is indeed the guy who's going to solidify this coalition. I've seen there was a headline a few weeks ago,
So the right liberals are trying to beat the mainstream media to this talking point, basically.
Yeah, and they're already starting to say, like, well, Trump's actually been pretty moderate on a lot of things. Like, we've been trying to destroy him and call him Hitler for 10 years now, but he's actually been pretty moderate and reasonable on all these issues. But Vance, on the other hand, like, this is the real threat to democracy. Like, come on. But it is really interesting to see the party try to take him apart. And I guess my thought, to kind of circle back to your question, why are they doing this, right? So even when it becomes clear that Vance is the candidate, why does it seem like there are some people who are right liberals, loosely on the right, who want to see Vance lose? Same opportunity that we were talking about in the last question is that if you can say, okay, Trump was an enigma, uniquely charismatic, unique moment in history, and then Vance carries his mantle, loses in 2028, that's the sign we needed. We just need to go back to W. Bush era GOP policies. And so I think that's it. I think if you can take down Vance and ensure that even if he's the candidate that he loses in 2028, that if we still have a country in 2032, they can try to reestablish power. I think it's just one more shot at the same fight, which, you have people in the think tank world and in the donor class for sure who want this brand of republicanism, who are willing to throw lots of money at it. But where's the voter base for this?
Mm-hmm.
It's just insane to me that they say, well, Trump and Vance, they're too extreme. They're not going to win generals. And Trump won at least 2 generals. And I think Vance is pretty strong in a lot of ways that people are underestimating. We can talk about that if you'd like. But I don't see where it comes from. You put, like, if you can anoint Nikki Haley the presidential contender in 2028, where's the coalition? Because most of MAGA, the new right, sits this out and says, oh, this is a liberal, a right liberal, I think, is the mentality of a lot of people. And the left isn't going to vote for her.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think they're like a decade behind on where their voting coalition is.
Well, right. And especially when you're talking about people in the donor class, I think they're used to just being able to buy elections. I think that works now. And it doesn't. The fundamentals in the American electorate have just changed too much. Yeah. It's easier to buy an election when everything feels like it's going well.
Right.
And you just need to pump resources and activate your certain number of people. But now, I think the vicissitudes of the political marketplace makes any play like that really difficult. Yeah. And they're, it's not only these right liberals who want to return to the old ways, the pre-Trump ways, the anti-Trump ways, going after JD. They're actually going after Marco Rubio as well. And they're trying to, like, create this division between JD and Marco. And Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance have different views on a lot of different issues. Like, they worked together on some things in the Senate and they didn't, and they disagreed. Mm-hmm. They've always been very close Senate colleagues and now administration colleagues. Like, their banter with, what was that profile from the New Yorker, I think, where it was like JD Vance said, I'd pay the photographer $1,000 to make Marco Rubio look bad. And then that picture of Marco Rubio came out and JD said, I guess I owe that guy $1,000. That's great. And they seem very very aligned, at least in terms of how to manage the coalition, how to maintain the coalition, not getting in front of the president, that type of stuff. And yet there's these people who are trying to create a false civil war in the administration. Of course, there's factions in every administration, every presidential administration. This one is no different. Yeah. But why are they trying to manufacture this tension between Marco Rubio and JD Vance? Like, are they actually, in these right liberals' minds, do they think, oh yeah, Marco Rubio will be the guy to give me what I want? Is that really their thinking? Or is it more about just trying to blow MAGA up, period?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I know the answer to it. Because, if you're trying to blow MAGA up, it's kind of a lame way to do it if these guys are actually the two most powerful Republicans not named Trump in the country and seem to work quite well together and like each other. I don't know how driving a fake wedge between them in the media's eye is going to do much of anything. I do wonder about the other possibility, though. I think it's a pretty bad one, but I think that the right liberal, the neocon element who was desperate to get rid of Trump, right? So 2020 was maybe lesson learned that backing like Nikki Haley is not the strongest way to dislodge MAGA from the Republican Party, because like 3% of the electorate is going to vote for her. Mm-hmm. So I do wonder a little bit if that faction has gotten a little bit more realistic and desperate and saying, look, if we just run somebody else who's a Nikki Haley-esque figure, and you can name a bunch of other ones, like maybe they're smart enough to realize that that's single digits in a primary, and they're just looking for absolutely anybody who can dislodge Vance. And I mean, again, if you look at the political landscape, there's nobody who's not named Marco Rubio who I think has any real shot at winning this primary if Vance runs. So is maybe Marco Rubio like the neocons' second worst option, but the only one who's not Vance who could actually win? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a pretty bad play. But I'll say one more thing because I think this is interesting. I think a lot of people have come around to Marco Rubio within the new right. The people who actually work around him and work around the administration seem to think very highly of both Vance and Rubio. But it's interesting that when you leave the Beltway, like I'm from Eastern Pennsylvania, so you go into like ordinary people, there's still a lingering distrust of Rubio and basically anybody who was involved in politics before Trump, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon. It's like if you were, because Rubio had some more neocon tendencies. I mean, he was in the party when that was the dominant strain. So I think that's an interesting dynamic, is that Vance has this unique advantage that he just wasn't really there. Like he said some things right when Trump was running that he had to kind of figure his explanation of, but he doesn't have a track record as a political figure before the era of Donald Trump. And that's a unique credential to bring into this fight.
He wasn't out there doing like immigration reform stuff. And
yeah.
And like I have totally, the not excuse, but like the explanation for Marco Rubio, which is like Marco Rubio is mugged by reality. Yeah. In the same way that the neocons were mugged by reality of the Vietnam War and came over to the right, quote unquote. They never really gave up their priors, but they joined a different coalition. Yeah. Marco Rubio seems to have shed at least some of those priors and come into this coalition as a very powerful person in the administration because he was mugged by reality of, what Washington actually wanted to do. All of these negotiations about immigration reform are just fake, right? It's just a way for them to try to launder more illegal immigrants in the country. And you learn that the hard way when you see, the last 2 years of the Obama administration, which, Obama deported a lot of people, but he was also changing the law or using the executive prerogative to bring as many people into the country, quote unquote, legally. And then you had Joe Biden do the same thing, plus mass illegal immigration from 2020 to 2024. That's not... But you still have these Loomer types, these Laura Loomer types out there saying that, wow, JD Vance, I mean, he's just such a massive liability. And, he was never really truly MAGA from the start. Well, I think Trump actually loves the conversion story. That's what I think a lot of people get wrong about Trump is like Trump will fight you hard and he wants you to punch back because and if you punch back, he will respect you. And if he can convert you, then like even more glory to his name, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Like the conversion story is very powerful for Trump. Yeah. He loves it. But Laura Loomer's running around saying, "Oh, JD Vance is a liability." You mentioned like he has some very clear strengths heading into sort of any election season. What are those strengths? Yeah.
So if I could add two things. Real quick, but I think one of the most interesting things Vance talks about this, and it's one of the most interesting couple of chapters I think in the book, is about his conversion to Trump. And he talks about, basically my political priorities, my policy ideas did not shift drastically from 2016 to when I was the VP candidate. What changed over those years was my view of the state of American institutions. And I think that's a really important insight through which to view the never Trump, MAGA, what's going on here, is that the people who are never Trump and are actually somewhat conservative in disposition tend to be under, I think, the delusion that America's institutions are maybe shifted to the left, but are fundamentally healthy, right? Mm-hmm. From the government agencies to media to higher education, all these things. If they're like a little left, but they'll come back, then Trump is not the medicine, right? It's extreme. But if the hour is late, and America's institutions are on the verge of collapse or complete leftist domination, then you think differently about what the correct remedy is to that. So I think that's the best explanation for Vance's own conversion toward Trump, and also the way to view a lot of this back and forth about whether Trump is, terrible or what we need. But to your question, why Vance is strong, I think two things are being overlooked. One, it's a hard job to be Trump's VP, right? He's dynamic. He's here. He's there. You do have to be a loyal explainer and defender of the president. But we have to go back even just a little bit. We have very short memories. Like Vance during the general, he was magnificent. I mean, his takedown of Tim Walz in the one vice presidential debate was a big turning point in the polls for Trump Vance. There was an exit poll that polled JD Vance's favorability highest of the 4 candidates on the ballots, which is interesting because everybody's he's unlikable, he's weird. That fell really flat, right? The JD Vance is a weird guy, whatever.
Right.
I
think Tim Walz out there looking like a psycho.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Very ironic. But when Vance is not the VP, whose basic job is to be Trump's loyal number 2, he's quite good. I mean, he's very good at decimating news anchors who are trying to be hostile because he's just smarter and quicker than all of them. He learns really fast on the job. You look at like early public figure Vance and how he was kind of shy. He was a little awkward. And then when he came on the scene for the Senate, he would still make some faux pas or some awkward but he got much better. He was a very good speaker. And to now, like he learns almost like a machine in how good he is at handling the media. So I think that'll only get better. I think once he can come out from under the shadow of being Trump's VP and be a presidential candidate, people will remember what a strong, relatable story he has and figure he is. And then the other thing that I have to say is, like, let's not forget over and over again that the presidential election is not a popularity contest. It's an electoral contest to get to 270, right? And I'm from Pennsylvania. You look through the middle county, the bellwether counties that call Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. I don't know. I think Vance on the ground with his story and who he is and how he can speak to these people, I think he plays pretty strong in the swing states. So I think to say that he's this massive liability is to be just too much on Twitter and not enough looking at like the political realities of what wins an election.
Mm-hmm. Final question for you. We've talked a little bit about his strengths. Outstanding questions, challenges for Vance as he is going to this midterm year and he potentially eyes a 2028 run.
Yeah. So I think one is just electoral turnout. I think that's a big question and a big challenge for anybody not named Trump now, right? Like, I mean, Trump is a TV star, right? He's bringing out people who've never voted before. He's brought a lot of them into the coalition, right? You have groups who never were really heavily involved in politics, or certainly not in Republican politics, like the Cubans who come and deliver like Dade County, Miami County to Trump, which is wild. You have bigger percentages of the Latino population, the Black population, just generally the middle American working class. That was typically like the heart of the Democrat Party starting to shift. So the open question, which is maybe not a unique weakness to Vance, but a weakness to anybody who's not Trump, is can you keep up the enthusiasm, right? Like, can you keep these coalitions here and then can you bring them out in the numbers that Trump did? That's an open question. And then I don't know if this is an electoral liability, but something that's still an ongoing issue is the hardline pro-life voters and pro-life thinkers and the Trump-Vance presidency, which I don't know if you have time. Do you want to do a quick conclusion on that? So this is a hard one for me because it's the only thing that comes close to a critical chapter in the book, I think, on Vance. But even that criticism is very nuanced. So basically, I think two sides of this. On the pro-life side, I'm a pro-lifer. Like I've been spit at praying outside of abortion clinics and cursed at, and like I'm there. Like I think the murder of the unborn is something that cannot be a backseat issue. But there's a really bad political reality that nobody seems to give due attention to, and it's that there was that headline about a month ago that Trump Vance is the least pro-life presidential or Republican administration in Republican history, and like, I'm sorry, Dobbs changes the game. Like when Roe and Casey get overruled, this is a Democratic issue for the first time in 50 years. It was really easy to be a pro-life Republican before Dobbs. Mm-hmm. Right? All you have to do is say how pro-life you are and raise money from the pro-lifers. And if you sound super pro-life, they're on board and they vote for you because you don't have to do anything. You can't do anything, right? There's a constitutional block. But now when it's actually on the ballot, we've had 50 years of an abortion culture. Forget about the country. The party's barely pro-life. You look at like that Pew Research poll from like a year or two ago, and like the percentage of Republican voters who want abortion to be illegal in most or all situations, like barely a majority of the Republican Party. So I think
Yeah, plurality even. I don't even think it was a majority in that poll. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So and we see this. Red states, when they have the choice between ban most or all abortion or legalize most or all abortion, they choose legalize. And these were in deep red states, some of these referenda over the last couple of years. So I think pro-lifers need to be
And part of the reason we lost is because pro-life movement wasn't ready to inherit a battle that's fought on 50 fronts rather than a single front.
Yeah, a dog caught a truck and didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
So that being said, Ryan Anderson at Ethics and Public Policy Center is a friend of my organization of mine, and he was saying recently at a talk, it's like what has to happen is the pro-lifers, we all have to be incrementalists in this culture because nothing else will work. What is the most effective legal and political means to have fewer abortions in this country that can actually stick, that can survive elections, that can survive legal challenges? That's the only coherent way to do politics at this point, because, trying to pass a federal abortion ban is going to get you primaried. The bill's never going to pass. If it did pass, they'd have a constitutional convention and enshrine abortion in the Constitution. We're so far from having a majority or even like a plurality that would pass it, most of this stuff, that I think modest incrementalism until the culture changes is the reality. So I'm a little bit like, spare me that like, oh, Vance and Trump are the first ones who are not pro-life purists. Like, no, they're the first Republicans on this stage who have actually had to deal with this as a political issue. Mm-hmm. So, but that being said, I think you want to be careful not to sacrifice the bully pulpit, especially as a Catholic, right? Vance is a Catholic, I'm a Catholic, we are morally obligated not to support things that are morally evil. So it is one thing to say the culture is not pro-life, there's no coalition, so sadly there is very little we can do to stop abortion in this country until we change the culture. That's within the realm of political prudence. I think a Republican pro-life politician can easily say that, but you can't say, I support. And I think those were slip-ups, but on the campaign trail, Vance did say a couple of like, I support, this decision from the court to allow women's access to the abortion pill, or supporting, any abortive practices. Like, we can politically, prudentially say, can't touch these, but we cannot and shouldn't say we support them, because then you're sending a moral message that these are good things when they're not.
Yeah. So that is and that goes back to the socially conservative wing of the party and the more technological aspect of the party. Now the technological vector of the party, right? Like Elon Musk puts chips in people's brains, he's in there, and now there's, like the Phyllis Schlafly Elon Musk gap is very, very wide. How do you deal with that?
Yeah.
So that's a challenge for him.
Yeah. I mean, we thought the libertarian conservative fusion of the 60s, 70s, 80s was complicated. Now you have, transhumanist Silicon Valley libertarians and like pro-life hardcore social conservatives in one party. It's interesting.
It's interesting, and we'll be keeping an eye on all of it. Thank you, Frank DeVito, for coming on the Signal.
Oh, thanks, Bradley. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.